Thank you, Mr. President. I rise briefly today to thank a number of my colleagues. The first, the senior senator from Mississippi, Senator Wicker, who has offered a bill called the 5G Spectrum Act. I have offered a bill pertaining to the 5G spectrum as well. And my two Democratic friends, Senator Schatz and Senator Cantwell, have offered a bill on that subject as well. We have been working enthusiastically and in good faith for some time to try to work out our differences on this legislation so we could pass it this calendar year. I regret that we're not going to be able to work out our differences for the moment, but we're going to continue our efforts in good faith. The good news about all this legislation is that we all agree that the FCC should conduct a public auction of the 5G spectrum. Now, what does that mean? We all have heard about 5G. It's extraordinarily fast internet, 100 times faster than we have right now. But in order for 5G to work, there is a certain part of our spectrum, or our radio waves, if you will, that the telecommunications have to use to deliver the 5G service. It's called the C-band. And of course, when we communicate between and among each other on the internet or by cell phones through wireless technology, all we're doing is sending electromagnetic radiation or radio waves from my device to your device. It's obviously more complicated than that, but at its fundamental level, that's what it is. These radio waves and the airwaves through which those radio waves travel, this electromagnetic radiation, belong to the American people. It's called spectrum, and that's what we mean when we talk about 5G spectrum. We can't lose sight of that fact. The wireless telecommunication companies provide an extraordinary service. They're going to make 5G possible with the help of the United States government and our other forms of government. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that none of this would be possible without that spectrum. And that is owned by the American people. That spectrum is essential. As a result of the efforts of some swamp creatures, both in and out of government, we came that close to having this spectrum, which belongs to the American people and is worth as much as $30 billion to $60 billion given away in a back room through a private auction to 3 satellite companies, which happen to be domiciled in foreign countries. The excuse given was that these 3 foreign satellite companies can conduct an auction themselves and allocate it to the American telecommunication companies who need it for 5G faster than the FCC can. Even though the FCC has only conducted about 100 of these public auctions, generating about $123 billion for the American people. Why? Because American people own the spectrum that's being auctioned off. It's theirs. But there was a proposal that came that close to passing at the FCC to just give this spectrum to these 3 companies, let them keep the $30 to $60 billion that the spectrum auction would have generated, and let them decide who was going to get to participate in the 5G effort throughout our country. Fortunately, and I want to thank the FCC at the last minute said no. and I want to thank them. Hence the legislation by Senator Wicker and myself and Senator Cantwell and Senator Schatz. And the good news about the legislation is that it would require a public auction by the FCC of the spectrum that belongs to the American people. That auction would be open to anybody who wants to bid. There would be a fair and level playing field, and it would be conducted in front of God and country in a public meeting. The best way to resist temptation, Mr. Chairman, is a strong set of values, a proper upbringing, and witnesses. And there would be witnesses to this auction. What we can agree on is how much money, if any, to give to the foreign satellite companies. Well, you say, why should we give them a dime? Well, the foreign satellite companies, the three companies to which this spectrum was almost given, they're currently using this spectrum. They don't need all of it. They don't even need close to all of it, but they've been using it for a number of years. The FCC just gave it to them. They didn't pay a dime for it. Now, I'm not criticizing them. They put it to good use, but they don't own it. They don't have a license. They have a sort of a 30-day, month-to-month lease. That's the way I think of it. And their lease agreement says that the FCC can take it back anytime it wants to. Since the satellite companies have been using the spectrum, and the satellite companies have customers, we want to be fair to these companies. And certainly when we decide how to allocate the proceeds of the public auction in front of God and country that the FCC is going to conduct, we certainly want to consider the satellite companies' interests. But I'm not going to support giving them half of the money that this auction generates, because this money belongs to the American people. And it can be used to extend 5G and other forms of broadband to those of us who don't live in major cities but happen to live in rural areas, but we are all still very much Americans. So I rise today to say, Mr. Chairman, thanks to Senator Wicker, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I've learned so much from working with him. I want to thank Senator Cantwell, Senator Schatz. We're going to keep working toward a compromise here in a way that will allocate this money to everybody fairly and efficiently. But I'm going to end as I began, Mr. President. First and foremost in my mind is the American people, because the American people own this spectrum. I don't own this spectrum. The United States Senate doesn't own this spectrum. The three foreign satellite companies don't own this spectrum. The FCC doesn't own this spectrum. The telecommunications companies, for which we are grateful, don't own the spectrum. The American people own the spectrum. And the vast majority of the money generated by this public auction should go to them. I yield the floor, Mr. President.